Hi, I'm John Elizondo, and this is Launchpad.
We saw, around 10 years ago or so, a really steep increase in the number of heat-related deaths.
You just heard from Dr. Jeffrey Howard, who's featured in this episode. He is one of 4 guests that we will talk to in this series that will discuss all things related to nature. In today's episode, is the heat stealing your youth? If you enjoy this conversation, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss any new episodes. Let's get started. Do you ever feel like you're literally melting the second you step outside in the Texas heat? Well, you're not. But that extreme temperature could be taking years off your life. Since 1999, heat has claimed more than 21,000 lives, and the trend is only getting worse. Joining us today is Dr. Jeffrey Howard from the Department of Public Health at UT San Antonio. His research into heat-related deaths has captured national headlines. Today, we're diving into his findings on premature mortality and how heat might actually be accelerating the aging process. Dr. Howard, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, let's jump into this. How did you decide that heat was a trauma that people are dealing with? What inspired you to look into this and to do this study?
Well, I had wondered about it for quite some time. And actually, I took a look at this maybe 10 years ago or something. And at the time, I didn't see any kind of trend really in that. It was kind of static from year to year, the number of heat-related deaths. I mean, it fluctuates a little bit, but there was no clear upward or downward trend. It was pretty flat for a long time. Just in the last few years, with the acceleration of warming that we've seen, it made me think about that. And I said, well, maybe I should go back and look at this again, because maybe now we might see something. In fact, we did see something. We saw that, around 10 years ago or so, a really steep increase in the number of heat-related deaths. We don't know the extent to which the increase is because we're getting better at identifying that as the cause of death, or if it's just because there are so many more that are happening. It's probably some mixture. We probably are getting a little better at identifying those deaths and flagging them as such. But I don't think it's all because we're getting better at identifying it. I think there's some combination of, we're doing a little bit better of that, but we are also just seeing more of these kinds of deaths. And you can also, there's studies that have examined, for example, emergency room visits for heat-related illnesses, and that's been increasing. What really triggered me to go look at this again is I read an article, and I think it was New York Times, but I could be mistaken. And it was talking about heat-related deaths, specifically in Maricopa County, Arizona. And in that article, it was talking about how, the previous 2 years have been the hottest on record and all this. When I read that, I thought, I should go look at this again nationally, not just, one area. And that's really what prompted me. I'd looked at it before, but when I read that article, it made me say, I should go look at this and see if there's been a change.
Speaking of the New York Times, you were featured in the New York Times for this study. As I read this article, one of the things I want to kind of switch on a tangent briefly about is when it comes to the reports of these heat deaths. And I found it very interesting that it says in the Times that the CDC relies on death certificates from local authorities, but there's no consistent criteria. Was that eye-opening to you?
Yeah, I knew that was the case. People that do this kind of research using death certificates like I do, we have a decent idea of how does a death certificate get filled out? Who is the person filling it out? And there's a ton of variability in how that process works. So depending on where you live, like if you live here in San Antonio, we have a medical examiner's office that has forensic pathologists so they can do autopsies. That's not happening for most deaths, but even still, we have strong medical infrastructure here in the city. But if I live way out, say in far West Texas, where there's not even a hospital, maybe there's 1 or 2 doctors or something like that, it's going to be one of them probably, or it might even be a justice of the peace. And so you can imagine the skill and training difference between a justice of the peace and a forensic pathologist who would be the most highly trained person to assess cause of death. And that's just in the state of Texas as an example. There's a very wide variation in training, background, protocols, all of those things. One thing that Maricopa County does quite well, and part of it's because they have to, because it's the hottest, big city in the country, is they have a pretty rigorous protocol for evaluating whether or not a death was related to heat exposure. But I would venture to guess that most places in the United States do not have something like that. New York City does, a handful of other places, but there's certainly no standardized protocol for that. And that is actually something that other researchers in this field have been calling for, is the development of a more standardized approach for how to assess this.
What I find interesting about this study is that your data suggests that heat is the deadliest natural disaster in America. I mean, we think about tornadoes and hurricanes and things that happen semi-frequently in this country, in certain parts of the country. But this really is almost on that same scale, if not, worse, because it happens more often.
Yeah,
that people don't realize.
That's exactly right. And, it hasn't been framed the same way, historically, as these other kinds of so-called natural disasters or environmental disasters, if you will. But I think that more and more, as we understand how interconnected the frequency and severity of storms like hurricanes and tornadoes and all of that is related to this warming, it's a more global pattern, that they should kind of be considered part of the same thing. And I'll also throw in another thing that's becoming increasingly dangerous are wildfires. It's a result of the increased warming. And so all of these things are related. And I think that we would benefit from having sort of a more comprehensive view of what it means to have environmental exposures that then lead to morbidity and mortality.
And, I think back to when we had that freeze here in San Antonio. I know the rest of the country looked at us and couldn't comprehend that we weren't prepared for a little bit of snow. But you reverse it with the heat, and I think about up in the Northeast.
Yes.
They're not prepared for those 30 days of 100-degree heat like we are down here. Should they be as equally prepared for the extreme heat as we should be for the cold?
Yeah, it's a great point. There's a lot of variability geographically in these deaths, as we would expect, because we know the climate's different. It differs across the country. We know what parts tend to be the hottest areas. But again, with the warming of the planet, those patterns are shifting. And so areas that used to not be so hot are now getting some of these extreme heat events that occur that they may not have had historically and are not prepared for. I think increasingly into the future, all jurisdictions are going to need to be thinking about preparations for how to mitigate the risks that come with those increasing temperatures and the increasing frequency of extreme heat.
What were some of those mitigation efforts that were suggested in the study?
Yeah, just making cooling centers available is a big one. We do that here in San Antonio. We have cooling centers. The unhoused population is particularly vulnerable to heat and to cold. Where we live, it's more heat than cold. Hydration stations, making those available throughout the city, having cooling blankets on hand in, say, like homeless shelters or other areas that could be used as cooling centers. Those are things that are, being done in places like San Antonio, places like Phoenix and other large cities. I don't know the extent to which some of the smaller towns that are also, vulnerable to this kind of heat, I don't know the extent to which they have the resources to do these kinds of things. But those are some of the things that we had suggested and that others have suggested in the research literature.
But at the same time, mitigation efforts can only go so far. I would assume many times people just ignore the signs of a heat stroke or a potential heat-related illness. What are some of those signs? What are some of the things that people should just be aware of and maybe not disregard in the moment?
Right. If you start, feeling dizzy, sometimes people get headaches. If you feel like you're hyperventilating or something like that, those can be signs to watch out for. If you're outside and it's hot and you start feeling these things, you should take measures to cool off.
I know you look at a lot of data, and I was curious to know, was there ever a specific case or a point when you were looking at the data that it moved from just numbers on a spreadsheet to maybe something more personal to you?
It's actually very personal to me. My father was severely injured in a motor vehicle crash when I was a young child, 5 years old. Yeah, he survived it, but he became a paraplegic. And so, as just kind of watching him age, he didn't necessarily look older than I thought he should, but he definitely developed chronic diseases at an earlier than I would expect age. And he also died young, relatively young, 69. That's always stuck with me that, was his aging trajectory altered by that traumatic injury? And, when I started working in this traumatic injury space for the military, I had that in the back of my mind, but again, I still hadn't kind of put it all together in terms of the accelerated aging. But yes, I mean, to me, I look at it and I think, I kind of see my dad in these numbers, the data that we track for military veterans, just looking at sort of their health trajectories over time. And as I see, rates of cardiovascular disease increasing or, rates of other kinds of diseases increasing, I think about my dad. So it definitely does have there's a personal, it's very personal to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that personal story with us. You mentioned that your premature death research has been going on for a while now, starting back when you worked with the Department of Defense. Can you explain how all this trauma research connects together?
A lot of the work I do focuses on individuals that have had a variety of injury exposures, and then trying to understand after that exposure, sort of what happens immediately. So the acute outcomes, which is basically like survival, complications and things like that. But then I also study the long-term impacts to health that are faced by survivors of that trauma. Once I graduated with my PhD and started in that line, I sort of just saw it as, okay, I'm doing this shift and I'm going to be focusing on this traumatic injury. And I didn't realize at the time that, because what I studied for my PhD was this concept of accelerated aging, but not within the context of injury. At the time, I didn't see them related. I thought, okay, I'm going to just kind of go in this new direction. But as I started to study the long-term effects, what I realized is it was really the same thing. And that these folks that had been exposed to these traumatic injuries were showing a lot of the same kinds of aging trajectories as other populations that I'd been studying before. And so now I kind of see all of these things as being very intertwined.
I want to unpack something real quick. You talk about traumas. Now, is that exclusively physical trauma? Is that another level of trauma, a more emotional trauma? I mean, because it kind of takes a little bit of everything, right?
Yep. I'm glad you asked that. The way I view it now is, when I say trauma, what I really mean is any kind of harmful exposure that causes a physiological insult to the organism. So that's kind of a technical definition, but basically what I'm saying is that both physical injury, so motor vehicle crash, a gunshot wound, an explosion, a fall, all of those are what I would call physical injuries. But other injuries can be just as injurious as those physical injuries. So you mentioned emotional trauma, psychological trauma. I would even suggest social trauma. All of those things, to me, are just different kinds of injuries. They wind up all contributing to the same kinds of physiological dysregulation that we see in physically injured people. The same kinds of things also happen to folks who don't have those physical injuries, but have other kinds of injuries, either emotional or psychological, what have you. So I consider trauma to be a very large sort of overarching framework for understanding how these kinds of exposures translate into physiological dysregulation, which essentially triggers accelerated aging and ultimately premature mortality.
And how do you define social trauma? I haven't heard that term used in that way before. What exactly does that entail?
I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say social trauma before, but I use that term. I'm sure somebody has used that term before, but I haven't heard it. But anyway, the way I think about it is social traumas would be things like social hierarchies that produce differential access to resources, inequality, discrimination like segregation, things like that, racism. Those kinds of things are what I would call like social trauma.
That makes a lot more sense. You talked about accelerated aging. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Is it what I think it is, accelerated aging? You're getting older faster, but caused by these traumas.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. When we think about age, I'm actually giving a lecture tomorrow to fourth-year medical students over at the medical school, and it's about this very topic. When I talk about this, I start off by asking the question, well, what is aging? What does it mean? The way we normally colloquially think about age is like, okay, I was born, this year, and I can count off the years and I know, chronologically how old I am. But that's not really what happens biologically. So there's a difference between chronological age and biological age. And most of us have known people before where we meet them and we're talking to them and we find out their chronological age and like, oh, I thought you were a lot older, or I thought you were a lot younger, or something like that. In some cases, you can actually see that on the surface, but not always. What I'm interested in is that process of what things speed up aging or slow down aging. And I've mainly studied the things that speed it up. And essentially, it just means that process, the physiological processes in our bodies are becoming increasingly dysregulated. So as we age, that tends to be what happens. That's why people, tend to get these age-related diseases because they're becoming more and more dysregulated over time. Mutations occur that leads to cancers, other things occur that lead to, plaques in the arteries and cardiovascular disease. And those are the top two causes of death in the United States. That whole acceleration of aging essentially is a biological process that means that from a biological perspective, you probably aren't the same age, if you will, as your chronological age. One of the points of this lecture that I'm going to do tomorrow is that where you live dictates that environmental kind of exposure set that you will face. And so the characteristics of your immediate environment have a lot to do with your aging process. And so I'm going to start off the lecture tomorrow by showing a map of San Antonio. And in that map, basically I have San Antonio split out into census tracts, which essentially you could kind of call neighborhoods. And each of those neighborhoods has a life expectancy associated. So if you're born in that area and you live in that area, this is the life expectancy in that area. Well, I don't know how many people know this, but just in San Antonio, there's a very wide discrepancy in life expectancy. And in parts of the south side, it's almost 20 years lower than parts of the north side. And so the question is, well, why is that? Why do we see this pattern? And a lot of it has to do with the characteristics of those areas and level of affluence, level of poverty, level of segregation, other kinds of access to other kinds of resources in those areas.
That's very interesting. And I'd love to get into that conversation another time. But Dr. Howard, before you go, I do want to give you one last chance to provide any kind of advice to our listeners that could help them in the future.
Yeah. So I think, one thing that's emerging in the research is almost supreme importance of sleep. Getting good sleep consistently. That is one of the top things that you can do And I'm also going to say another thing you can do is drink coffee or tea. Coffee, there's a recent study that came out showing, again, that drinking coffee and tea is associated with slowing the aging process. So, number one, get good sleep. Try to do that as best you can. One of the most important things, I track it myself through my smartwatch, and it's just vitally important.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Howard, for joining us today. This was very insightful. Learned a lot of great information, and we hope we can talk to you again soon.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
This episode of Launchpad is brought to you by the Office of University Strategic Communications at the University of Texas at San Antonio. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you click the subscribe button right now. And for more great content from UT San Antonio, click right here.